3 today. The period is 1886 to the turn of the century, 1900. And the session is called Tradition and Innovation in Modern Painting. Now, this is an impressionist, post-impressionist period, and I chose it because it's a point of confusion for people in the world. 1900 was as dramatic as it is for us right now during all of the changes taking place. Many cultural and technical innovations were taking place. X-ray was discovered, large corporations were starting, electricity and plumbing was being integrated into the homes prior to this. Prior to the 1900s, an average family made about $3,000 a year, and that started to change as innovation took place. But probably the most important innovation for the artist was the Brownie Camera. In 1900, the Brownie Camera put the snapshot in the hands of everybody. And it was that artists painted what was in front of them and what was inside of them, and they broke with tradition at this period because they felt that the camera can do the realism. We're going to do what's in our heart and mind. And that was really the onset of Impressionism. It was a breaking away from tradition, building on it, but breaking away from it. And essentially, what the artists had to prove is they didn't need to be perfect, but they had to be convincing, because they were using color and lines and shapes in ways that defied realism, which is what people purchased. I want a photograph, I will hire an artist, and they will do a portrait of me. I want this scene outside our home, I will hire an artist, and I will have it captured. So the artist felt free. And the first artist we're going to take a look at is Claude Monet. And Claude Monet kind of wrapped up the Impressionistic period where color and light are in the foreground. He dabbed with pure paint and with layers and layers on top of his paintings, numerous rapid brush strokes with short broken color. He focused on the sun and the moon and how it bathed objects in light. And that's what he tried to capture in this painting that we're looking at called the Water Lily Pond or Green Harmony. Now, at the turn of the century, in the late 1900s, Monet finally made enough money to move to a home outside of Paris. And when he moved to a home, he was a gardener and a painter, and he began to create his garden. And it would be this garden that became his subject for the rest of his life, for nearly 30 years. And the garden is a very interesting story because of these two canvases, his painting canvas and his garden, he put all of his heart into this garden. He rerouted a river through his yard to create the pond, despite the fact that the city did not permit it. He brought in lilies from Egypt and South America, despite the fact that the city wanted to levy fines against him for bringing in poisonous plants. So Monet, with his single-mindedness, created this garden for himself that many visitors to the garden said it looked like he took a paintbrush and he just painted his garden. It was that vibrant. So during the course of the last 30 years of Monet's life, he painted, in this particular case, this Japanese bridge over water 17 times from the same position. But he has about 250 water lily paintings that he did. He'd set up his easel and he just painted. At the end of his life, around 1890s, a special show was presented for him in France. And he desired that this show would be, these were very large paintings, would be in an oval room. So when you entered this room, you were surrounded by these paintings encompassing you, these water lily paintings. So that's a little bit of the background on Claude Monet. He destroyed about 17 of his paintings at the end of his life because he didn't like them. He just didn't think they were good. So now we go towards this painting, and Priscilla, do you have the painting up? I have a, I think
I
what
do. I do.
Okay.
It's everyone can see it. There's different versions of it up, but they can.
Okay, great. So now you know a little bit about Claude Monet, and he's wrapping up the Impressionist period in the late 1890s with his series of water lilies. So if you take a look at this painting now, and this is where I'd like to involve all of us as we travel over this amazing water lily painting. First of all, when you take a look at it, and there are no right answers, by the way, art historians, museum curators, and art critics all have their opinion on paintings, and they all vary. And it's really a matter of your perception and your life and how you view a painting that's real. So when you look at this painting, where is your eye drawn first, would you say? And just jump in. Anyone can. What attracts your eye, first of all, when you look at the painting? Any thoughts?
I would say probably the bridge. Susan, what do you think?
Well, I see the reflective pond and that kind of very clear area where it's like very realistic in its reflection of the growth. That's what I see.
And how did Monet guide you into his painting? What is he doing, do you think, in here? And think about clusters of like circles and triangles and lines. Is there a mechanism he's using to take you under the bridge and into the background? What has he done, would you say?
And please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to make a comment. I'm seeing like the reeds, those bushes that are kind of pointing inwards, maybe, Kathy, on the side. Those are sort of catching my eye. I don't know the word for them.
Well, there are a couple things going on. First of all, this graceful footbridge creates kind of a harmony and anchors the composition. It levitates above the pond. It's not in the banks. It does not link the banks together. And what draws us in for the most part is look how the pond narrows all the way to a point in a deep triangle in the center. Your eye is forced to follow that subconsciously. And then the smooth texture of the bridge contrasts, I think, with what you were talking about, these swaying fronds on the side, the grasses that go over and under the bridge. And the other thing that he did is he used layers and layers, we can't see it really here, but layers and layers of paint to create a crust. So if we were to look at the real painting, you could almost walk on top of the water lilies. They would be so thick. And the reflection again draws you in. I almost think that there is a meandering river type feeling as you follow these water lilies in front of the bridge to a Z and then back all the way to the point in the back of the picture. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Monet wanted us to feel a sense of solitude and reflection when we looked at his paintings. He was rushed, he was hurried, he was anxious when he painted them, trying to capture light, trying to capture the color, and it's why he discarded so many of them and had so many bad days, his wife said. But can you tell me what feeling you get when you take a look at this painting? Any thoughts?
What was your question?
What feeling you get when you look at this painting?
I get serenity.
And that's serenity. Any other thought?
It's very peaceful. There aren't any birds or anything that denotes any sound. The water is very calm, so it's like silence.
So if an artist were painting this and you had to guess what was in the mind and heart of the artist, what was Monet thinking, do you imagine? What was he after?
Peace.
That's
Peace.
what I would have said too. Yeah.
The sensations as well as his observations through color and tone. It's kind of a yellow-green color, and I think in reality there's maroon in here that draws us into the painting too. Does the bridge, does this scene remind you of anything in your life that you've seen? No?
No.
That's what I'd like to have in my life.
Yes.
Beautiful.
If you could ask the artist anything, would you ask him a question about it?
Mm. Mm.
I feel as if since he created the garden himself and had to go through all the problems of bringing in the lilies, I think it was something that was very close to his heart. And so he kept painting it until it became something that he had in his mind.
I think so.
I think that's very good.
I think that's very good, especially since he painted this, as I mentioned, about 17 times.
Wow.
Plus his lily pond became his obsession
Yes.
for the rest of his life. He was after something.
Mhm.
Now, there are other things that are going on within this picture, that this painting that is different than all of the other Impressionist paintings. And he set a precedent that other artists followed. Up until this point, Impressionist artists had you stand back and look into the painting. That painting had borders. It may have a sea or buildings, but you got the impression you were looking into the painting. What Monet did is he had you stand in the pond. There are no borders, there's no sky, there's no horizon line. So all the markers are gone. The edge of the water, the sky, or distant trees, they've all disappeared. And you are just facing those lilies without clouds, kind of lost in the expanse of water and light. He kind of forever changed the vision of Impressionism and created a new form by doing this, because prior to it, you stood back and you looked in.
Mhm.
Can you see that?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
He draws you in. Sure.
It draws you in.
It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So encompassing. It encompasses everything.
It
You know, you feel,
encompasses.
well, it just draws you in completely. You know, it's very fulfilling.
For some reason, my eye goes right to the almost middle of the picture to that little spot of green under the bridge, a little to the left. And I don't know why it draws me in, but it just takes me right into this picture. It is very soothing, isn't it?
Mm.
Let's see. I think that's all that I have for this particular painting, other than his intent was really to create a vignette without borders, that the painting would go on. And you can imagine this painting covering a large wall in an oval room surrounded by other pads of lilies.
How large was the painting actually?
This paint, can you help me if I tell you in centimeters? This
Yeah.
painting is 88.3 by 93.1 centimeters. What is that? I don't.
So that's about, you know, almost 9 9 by 9 meters. So
Wow.
that's close to, I mean, 9 meters would be close to 18. That's close to a meter's close to a yard, right? So you're getting close to 27 by 27 feet. But I will look exactly.
It's
Whoa.
large.
I'm going
Right.
to Google that.
That's
Right.
like
Yeah.
the whole pond.
It's huge.
Well,
It's
and
huge. Oh my
it's huge.
God.
And he painted outside.
Oh.
So you can just imagine, they were all painted outside.
Mm, mm, mm.
In the handout, there's an interesting quote by Monet, and he says, "People discuss my art and pretend to understand as if it were necessary to understand when it's simply necessary to love."
Mm.
I was the chairman of the art docents when my children were in school. And one of the things I always told them was to look into a painting, not at it.
Yes.
I think that gives you a much better idea of what's going on. The other thing is that I thought I had seen this painting, and I don't recall it being that large, Priscilla.
No, you're right.
Maybe
It's
not
okay.
this particular one, but one of them.
No, you're right. It's 3 feet by 2.5 feet. So I was,
More like it.
I was off. Sorry, everybody.
27
Susan,
feet.
you were thinking, oh no. Yeah.
We'd have to have scaffolding.
Yeah. Exactly.
Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me.
That's cute.
So remember this painting because this was done in about 1899. And it's really the end of Impressionism, and we're going to move towards Post or after Impressionism. And the other two artists that we look at took the concept of light and color in a different direction. So we'll take a look at Vincent van Gogh's painting that was done now in 1899, and it's Starry, Starry Night. And I know all of you know of it because it is a powerful painting that still remains a source of a lot of speculation because of Van Gogh's life.
Starry, Starry Night, right?
Starry, Starry Night. It was done in 1889, and Van Gogh, as you know, led a very tortuous life. He was very difficult as a child and struggled to find his purpose in life. He lived with depression. He had a tremendously spiritual foundation within him, very sensitive. His paintings were emotional and visually kind of arresting throughout the course of his painting career, and he only painted for 10 years from 1881 to 1890. And he suffered a breakdown a year before he painted this painting. And it was a year after this painting that he committed suicide. So he painted for 10 years, but he was prolific. He painted about 800 paintings and about 700 drawings. He's remembered for this striking color, quick brushstroke, and masterful, a genius, and leading you around the painting with the way his strokes were. You had to travel the way he intended you to, and you couldn't veer off with these short strokes swirling you and taking you around the painting. In many ways, the historians state that the turmoil in his life reflected his paintings. So we can take a look at Starry Night, again in 1889. And this was during the time that Monet was painting, but with Post-Impressionists, they were interested in pure colors and broken brush strokes. And if you'll remember the water lilies, it was muted and blended. This is not. We'll take a look at evaluating or analyzing a little bit of what might be going on in this painting. For those of you who know Van Gogh's life, you know that after he spent time with his fellow artist Gauguin, and after they had a tiff and he cut off his ear, he self-instituted himself in an asylum in France. And it was a small room where he looked out over what was perceived to be a valley like this. He couldn't paint in his room, but the asylum gave him another room to paint in. So many of his paintings were done in another room. He liked to paint from observation, not imagination. So while the literature and the critics state that this is what he may have seen from his small window in his room, the truth is, if you were to look out that window, you would not see the village. You would not see the tree nor the hillsides. As a matter of fact, the steeple is more reflective of a Holland steeple than a steeple in France. So Van Gogh painted this during depression, during a nervous breakdown in the asylum in France. So if we take a look at the painting now, and let's talk about the uniqueness of this particular painting. Let's just start again. Where's your eye drawn immediately when you take a look at this painting? What do you see?
The swirl in the
Big
middle.
swirl.
Mm-hmm.
Right in the middle of that large swirl.
Yes.
And
The
the
movement, right.
it reaches almost to the top of the sky, kind of linking the land and the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So that swirl, and again, remember that this vibrant color, and Van Gogh squeezed the tube of paint onto the canvas, and he used a palette knife. So the colors were pure. He liked to paint the night. As a matter of fact, while painting many of his night paintings, he hung candles around the brim of his hat and around the picture. He could see the painting during the night as he captured the painting. Now, how did Van Gogh guide us through this painting? What are some of the things in here? And I can start out. That painting, the turbulent, agitated, intensely swirling patterns take us all over. And do you see this white globe right to the right of the cypress tree? That's Venus.
Oh, gee.
Oh,
So astronomers evaluated it because there's so much interest in this painting. They were determined to find out, was it a quarter moon or full moon? Was that Venus? The moon is incorrect apparently, but that is Venus that Van Gogh captured. The thickness and thinness of his strokes guide us also. And where are the very thick strokes, would you say?
Where what?
The very thick strokes, where are they?
They're in that swirl.
They're in the swirl. And where do you see the thin strokes?
I see the thin strokes in the swirl.
You do
I see
too,
the
all
thick
right.
strokes. I see the thick strokes. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
On the roof of the houses, he's pushing us in. Do you see him leading us into that painting? Do you see the top of the cypress tree leading you and pointing you to the swirls? He's also using color as contrast. And what colors? The cool and the warm,
yeah.
don't they?
Yes.
I think it's a little difficult for me because of the colors he's using to determine the broad strokes from the thinner strokes, the bolder strokes. They all kind of seem to blend together. So I think it's the colors that are kind of throwing me off and looking for the, the thick strokes and the thin strokes.
I think so. Yeah, I understand that, and this is a reproduction, so I'm always curious to know what would the real life painting look like.
Oh, yeah, wow.
But you can see in the village, and the village doesn't exist. It's from his imagination, which is unusual for Van Gogh because, again, he painted from observation, not from his imagination. But when you take a look at the small village, the contrast between those small brushstrokes and how your eye is captured by the swirl that Susan talked about is a tremendous contrast in
Yeah,
stroke.
I see that now. You really have to focus on the village because the picture is a little small and it's down there and not the main point that you focus on for me, which is the swirl.
And
Yes,
that's right.
I can see broad strokes now, simple strokes on the village and the roofs and the outlines there.
He also created another contrast in that village to help with harmony and unity. Any idea what that might be? They're very small and insignificant, but powerful.
Well, Kathy, I see, I don't think you're talking about it, but the way he outlined the buildings and the hills strikes me. And if you're talking about color, then the windows, maybe buildings.
There you go. Those little dabs of yellow, which appear to be insignificant, have a tremendous balance for the warm colors in that painting up in the sky.
Wow, that's amazing. That's
Well,
amazing.
it gives the tone substance. It makes it like people are living there, that it's real.
Yes.
True.
Yes, it does.
Very good.
I think the contrast between what must be going on in his head as far as mentally within the swirl to the calmness and like Susan said, the reality of the village. It's like the real versus the unreal in his head.
Right. Does anyone know what the cypress tree represents in history, in symbolism?
You know what? I don't.
Link between life and death.
Okay.
Interesting.
Because it does seem like it's reaching towards heaven. I mean,
Right.
He made the cypress tree very large in comparison to the village also.
Yes, he did, didn't he?
It's closer to him.
Ah, that's right. The tree is closer to him.
A good point, especially if he commits suicide. Maybe he's feeling that at this point.
Now, it's a very interesting painting, and again, it's puzzling why this piece of work is so powerful and remains a source of speculation. Everyone knows this painting. You know Starry, Starry Night. Yet, there's just something unsettling about it. It is not firmly seated in reality. It is an impression. It evokes a feeling, and it isn't necessarily a calm and peaceful feeling, would you say? Is it?
The village.
No, you know what? I think it's out of the confusion of his mind and his health problems, because the top part is very emotional, very well, to me it's very emotional. It's very fast moving. The bottom, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. It's very quiet. It's nighttime. It's still. So I think that's represents his life.
And adding to that, his father was a pastor, a spiritual leader, and so the teaching sunk deep within Vincent van Gogh. So I think it's also interesting that the steeple and the church is prominent in the painting.
Yes.
In the village.
It's not there by accident.
No, it isn't there by accident. And I think your perception is correct that somewhere there's a medium, and it's between this emotion in the sky in this refuge in the valley.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's very sad that with all the paintings he had, which now sell for many millions of dollars, he only sold one painting in his lifetime.
He only sold one, and it was his brother Theo that encouraged him to paint, and that was his financial support. And in the end, they died so close to one another and were buried in the same area together. So this is, I think it is right. So many artists really didn't get the recognition until years after they passed away, and led kind of turbulent lives. And Van Gogh, Monet, and the next artist we're going to take a look at really lived and painted during 1900, this very tumultuous time in the history of the world. Just as every turn of the century brings about changes, so did it in the minds of and hearts of these artists. So this is Van Gogh, and again, this was done in 1889. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. And I don't have any real quotes from Van Gogh expressing his feelings about his paintings, other than he thought, when he wrote to Theo, and many of Van Gogh's letters are in archives, he expressed what his feelings were, but he thought this painting was a disaster. He hated it. He thought it was a failure. He thought it was a failure. So he sent all of these paintings to Theo, his brother, who then, I think his daughter then, years later, began to sell them around the world. So it's a very interesting story about Van Gogh, one of the most famous artists, really, of all time. So now we move to the next in the series. We looked at Monet, who had gentle, soothing, blended brushstrokes. And we moved to Van Gogh, who's post-impression, and started to use paint brilliantly. Don't blend it, don't mix it up. Keep it pure, primary colors. And now we go to a man named Andre Derain, who painted the London Bridge. So this is a sequence. So we're moving on to the end of Impressionism, to Post-Impressionism, and Andre Derain started a 5-year group called the Fauves. And their intention was strong brushstrokes, non-natural color usage, bold painting techniques, and using paint right out of the tube. They used a palette knife to apply the paint and create a crust. And that was the intent, that there's a sense of pulling you into the painting if you have darker colors in the foreground and lighter colors in the background, if you have texture in the foreground and smooth into the background, it draws you in, and it's a technique they used. Andre Derain was commissioned by his art dealer to go to London from France and paint the London Bridge. And the London Bridge in the 1900s was one of several bridges built over the River Thames. And it was built by London because they wanted to merge into the 20th century. It brought them into modern. London was in the throes of transition in 1900. People left the country and moved to the city to work in widget factories. So agrarian became urban. We see factories in the background in most of Andre Derain's painting. He painted London in a radically different way than it had been previously painted. Previously, the artist painted what you would expect: fog, mist, hidden in the lights of the bridge, realism. And he said, and I'm going to quote this, I don't think I've got it down, Fauvism was our ordeal by fire. It was an era photography. This may have influenced us and played a part in our reaction against anything resembling a snapshot of life. No matter how far we moved away from things, it was never far enough. Colors became charges of dynamite.
Wow.
That's a rebel, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's someone who said, use your camera, don't use me. So, this period called Fauvism, again, lasted from about 1905 to 1910. And then what ushered in was Cubism.
Cubism.
Derain was a very good friend of Picasso's. So as Picasso looked at the Fauvism swashes of color and exaggeration, and also Derain's love for African masks and African symbolism and African color, Picasso picked this up and began his journey following post-impression into the Cubist era. And Derain was quite influential in that transition. So we take a look at this painting now and we'll ask ourselves the same kinds of questions. What draws us in? What is he doing here in this painting with these colors? And I can help us out a little bit. Look at the line of that bridge.
Yeah.
Where does that line take you?
Into
That's
the
what-
city.
Right into the picture. And look at that red sky and color of the water. Is that a contrast? It is.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And what does that cityscape in the back tell you based on what you now know of 1900 London? What is he trying to depict life is like?
Confusing.
Industrial.
Hmm?
That it's industrial.
It's industrial.
Hmm.
And if we were to look at a really good rendition of this painting, you would see that the lighter areas of pink and white are smoke, fog coming out of those factory tops.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Pollution. Pollution.
Yeah.
The water and focal point, the bridge line draws you into the painting. The bold contrast of color, exuberant brushwork, has a sense of creative energy. He didn't even try to blend in those greens and yellows and blues as they swirl under that, or under those boats and under that bridge. He's just saying, I'm not perfect, but I'm convincing. He applied thick dabs of paint in a methodical fashion. Unblended colors in the sky and the water contrast each other. And it's almost two-dimensional, isn't it? It's almost flat.
Hmm.
So he's guiding us into the painting, and we know for sure it's the bridge that he has pointed us to the one-point perspective. Is there anything else that you see in this painting? How about complexity versus simplicity? What would you say?
Well, when I look at it, you sort of you look at part of it and you think, oh, it almost looks like a child drew that with crayons, even though you know that they couldn't. You know, that's not how a child would draw that, but that's sort of an impression that I get.
Well, and I think what we're seeing here is a little bit of his affinity for African art and the influence of simple lines in African art and symbolism. If you take a look at those arcs or whatever's holding the bridge up, you see he's repeating arcs, he's repeating squares, he's repeating lines. So he has repetition and rhythm amidst the confusion on top of that bridge. He's still holding us down and grounding this painting so that the eye that looks for order is not caught up in total chaos. We are still looking at a sense of order.
If I may, when I first looked at it, and I'm not familiar with this particular painting, I used to collect naive art. And so that was my first impression because of the way that he has painted, especially the bridge and some of the other items in here. But as I looked closer, I saw that it really was not a naive painting. And so I think that he basically has used a couple of different styles.
Right. I think you're right. There's symbolism. There's a sense of stability here in his painting, and it's elusive. It shouldn't be, but there is. I think through his repetition of forms, the use of his color.
Yeah. Now I see it better, don't you? Yeah. We enlarged it a little bit on a screen so we can see it a little better. It's very interesting. Did you say, Kathy, that he was commissioned to draw the bridge to encourage, to bring them into the new century, bring London into the new century?
He was commissioned to do this painting because Monet had just exhibited hundreds of his paintings in France. So the art dealer wanted a balance. He wanted something different. So he sent Derain to London, knowing full well of the style of this artist. And the expectations were such that the rendering would be of this style.
I see.
It was.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's very interesting if that was the case where the comparison of the two, that this one also has a bridge.
That's right. I didn't think of that. That is exactly, good for you. That's right.
What'd you say?
This one also has a bridge.
Oh.
Yeah, it also has a bridge.
So we looked at Monet, Peaceful, Serene. We looked at Starry Night, which was, you could see the emotions of the artist in it, and they were traumatic. What emotion is in Andre Derain's London Bridge? What do you feel when you look at this?
Maybe excitement.
Actually not at peace, like too much chaos going on.
And what was that? I'm sorry.
Too much chaos. There's just too many conflicting things with your eyes.
Yeah, it's busy.
Mm-hmm.
He tries to ground you, but
yeah, that's what I feel. I feel it's kind of, trying to draw you into London with the water and the boats and that kind of nice peaceful feeling there. But then in the background, you see all the busyness and the chaos and the work and the smokestacks and the hard life.
so,
But they're trying to make it look appealing, I think.
so if you have a minute and you take a look at other Andre Derain's paintings, you will see them all the same. And where he said colors become charges of dynamite, that's exactly how he paints. He left this period in 5 years and he moved to a more moderate style of painting after he got this out of his system, essentially.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like he dabbled in this because it was kind of popular and then decided it wasn't for him.
Something like that, or maybe as an artist, and this is what he may have, what he expressed in some of his interviews. He believes that colors should be used to express an artist's feelings about a subject rather than simply describe what it looks like. So this was
color definitely tells you that the smokestacks and the industry is kind of taking over that city. It's not, doesn't have a good look about it.
No, it doesn't. In any of his other London Bridge paintings, the same message is given. We are in transition. A revolution is taking place. Industrialization is happening. Large corporations have taken over. The worker the child worker, the woman worker works around the clock. Workers have no benefits. We are making things, competing. This is a global, kind of a global attempt to move London into trade and the markets, and at the expense of really their citizens. And the history of London at the turn of the century was very brutal in the 1900s, as it is in the United States, and we'll see that in other paintings as we look at it. Industrialization isn't kind to the human being.
Or the environment.
Nor the environment. So these three paintings that we looked at were kind of punctuation marks at the end of an era of Impressionism and what was called Post-Impressionism, and that centered on how light and color was used, how the brushstroke became muted and blended, or very aggressive and very bright. On the impressions that the artists had, that they finally did not have to render realism, that they could render artist images from their impressions and their feelings. Let the camera do the other part. The next paintings that we look at take us a little bit further into the 1900s as we move on to more kind of social commentary and how the artists perceived the world that they lived in. I think one final thought is that these artists all struggled. To be an artist was a struggle for all of these artists as they tried to get what was inside of them out on a canvas. And it wasn't necessarily for you and I, it was for them. But we have it to look at, and it's a reflection of the time that they lived in and how they felt about that time. So I hope you enjoyed this session. This ends it. And we'll have 3 more paintings to take a look at next Monday.